We all cheer great films, imagining ourselves as the protagonists. Unfortunately, there are instances where people took that silver screen inspiration too literally, suffering the worst possible outcome in real life. Back to the Future tells the story of high schooler Marty McFly, who accidentally transports himself back to 1955 in a time-traveling DeLorean. Early in the film, Marty hangs on to the back of a truck while riding his skateboard to get some extra speed on the way to school. Later, after he's been displaced in time and trapped in the past, the film unveils one of its most memorable sequences, featuring Marty attempting to escape the clutches of bruiser bully Biff Tannen. Referencing the earlier scene, he creates a makeshift skateboard that he then uses to skate away from his pursuers, which puzzles onlookers as such an item had yet to be invented. Once again, Marty speeds away by grabbing onto the back of a truck while riding the board. In June 1987, a group of teenagers were recreating the scene in Jenks, Oklahoma. They were holding onto the back of cars and go-karts when 13-year-old Mark Smith's skateboard hit the tire of one of the go-karts. Losing his balance, he fell and hit his head, sadly passing away 5 days later. The outlandish, dangerous, and disgusting antics of Johnny Knoxville and friends pushed the boundaries of absurdist behavior when MTV's Jackass was unleashed upon the masses in 2000. That success paved the way for a feature film version. Although it was accompanied with an R rating and a "do not try this at home" warning, attempts to Xerox the stunts of Knoxville and his crew did indeed happen, leading to predictably sad results. One fateful night in December 2002, 15-year-old Stephen Paul Rowan of Albuquerque, New Mexico was killed when he attempted to hold on to a moving truck but lost his grip and slipped when the driver slammed on the brakes. Rowan fell and was dragged underneath. Albuquerque police spokesperson Jeff Arbogast announced that the teens were inspired by a scene they saw while watching Jackass the movie. MTV sent their condolences, noting, "We're sorry to hear that this unfortunate incident has happened. No matter how a tragedy occurs, it's especially horrible when a young person is involved." However, they also claimed that there was no actual stunt in the film similar to what led to Rowan's passing. The Fast and Furious film franchise features some of the craziest car crashes and riskiest racing stunts ever devised. In 2003, Too Fast, Too Furious saw Paul Walker returning from the first installment as AWOL cop Brian O'Connor, who's made his way from California to Miami living off the winnings of drag races he's won while crossing the country. While the story sees him working to take down a drug lord, high-speed stunts remain the primary attraction. Shortly after Too Fast, Too Furious was released, 17-year-old William Lacoste Jr. was returning home from seeing the film when he pulled out of the Miami gas station in a Corvette. He was challenged to a drag race by two cars. He took his challengers up on the offer, but he quickly lost control, crashing into a concrete light pole and soon thereafter passing away. Lacoste's father later stated that had he been aware that Too Fast, Too Furious was the movie his son was going to see, he'd have never let him take the car. The film was blamed for a rise in racing and other accidents in Miami at the time, criticism similar to ones levied at the first film when it was released in 2001. At the time of Lacoste's passing, Miami Police Lieutenant Bill Schwartz stated that teenagers couldn't differentiate between the effects of drag racing they see on screen and the potential real-life consequences of racing, noting, "They don't understand that those people are stunt drivers and that they can get killed." Into the Wild is based on the real-life tale of college graduate Chris McCandless, who gives away all his money after deciding to travel to Alaska to live off the land. His experiences in the wild and the life lessons he learns along the way are the centerpiece of the film. Finding the enlightenment he was seeking, he seeks to return to his family, but he finds his former path now blocked. The quiet stream he once crossed has become an impassable raging river due to melting snow. In the end, he poisons himself by eating the wrong plant, sadly causing his own accidental death.
What if I were smiling and running into your arms?
In 2013, 18-year-old Jonathan Kroom, who had become obsessed with Into the Wild, decided to follow McCandless's example and leave his life behind. Kroom traveled to the Pacific Northwest from his home in Arizona despite having never lived off the land and having limited camping experience. When Kroom disappeared from the town of Riddle, Oregon, police began searching for him. His abandoned car was eventually found with his wallet inside. A week later, authorities discovered his body just 1,000 feet from the wooded area where his car had been recovered. While authorities believed Kroom killed himself, Kroom's family drew a correlation between his and McCandless's respective experiences. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 features Spidey's battles against Electro and the Green Goblin, while he also investigates the mystery behind his parents' passing. Andrew Garfield's brooding turn as Peter Parker was a departure from previous films, but Spidey in any form remains a colorful character that children respond to. Unfortunately, when young children don't realize the difference between movie magic and real life, tragedy can result. Just a week after the film was released in Indonesia, a 5-year-old boy in Jakarta named Valentino was told that his family wouldn't be able to go see it because his younger sibling was ill. He angrily locked himself in his room, opened the window, and apparently tried to crawl down the side of his apartment building. He sadly fell 19 stories, and despite the best efforts of doctors, he passed away. Authorities learned that he liked to imitate other superheroes he loved, such as Captain America and Iron Man, so it wasn't much of a stretch to assume that he was hoping to emulate Spider-Man. 2002's Blue Crush stars Kate Bosworth as Anne-Marie, a surfer struggling to overcome her own failures and the distractions of a fling with an NFL player, while also trying to win the surfing competition that has previously eluded her. Like every great sports film, Blue Crush has training scenes featuring our hero striving to push herself beyond her limits in pursuit of that moment of victory she is so desperate to achieve. One of those scenes showcases a unique endurance training exercise as Anne-Marie is running at the bottom of the ocean, carrying a heavy rock that weighs her down until she can take no more and is forced to return to the surface to catch her breath. While the technique is a legitimate one, it shouldn't be attempted without careful consideration and safeguards. Unfortunately, in September 2013, a group of children attempted to create their own version of the stunt. They swam across a pond in Port Salerno, Florida, while carrying different objects, including a baby carriage and a milk jug. The group found a heavy chain that a girl from the group wrapped around herself, but she removed it, feeling it was too much for her to handle. 13-year-old Anthony Michael Alfonson decided to instead wrap the heavy chain around himself, realizing all too late that the chain was too heavy and he slipped under the water. His friends attempted to help, as did nearby parents, but it was too late. Authorities ruled his death an accidental drowning. Pirates of the Caribbean franchise features all the hallmarks of high adventure on the seven seas. In the first film, Curse of the Black Pearl, Johnny Depp's Captain Jack Sparrow is sentenced to death by hanging, but he escapes the noose with the assistance of Will Turner's sword, which was flung at the gallows as the platform dropped, allowing Sparrow to balance himself atop the sword until he is finally freed. After renting the film, 12-year-old British boy Scott Buckle was unfortunately inspired to imitate the scene in his home, accidentally hanging himself in the process. During a hearing regarding the circumstances that led to Buckle's passing, psychiatrist John Talbot testified that the scene gave the impression that somebody could escape from such circumstances. He also testified that Buckle's own personal background would have led him to identifying with Captain Jack. Buckle's adoptive parents testified that not only did he act as if he was invincible to harm, he was also prone to imitate things. Sadly, he made the mistake of imitating something that only movie magic could accomplish. Denzel Washington stars in 2004's Man on Fire as former CIA operative John Creasy, who goes on a deadly rampage to recover the abducted 9-year-old girl he had been tasked with protecting. Early in the movie, Creasy is a lost soul, throwing back liquor all day and night, not caring if his unlucky number comes up or not. His relationship with the girl helps bring him out of that darkness.
I pulled the trigger and clicked, nothing.
The twist late in the film is that the very man who hired Creasy to protect his daughter is actually the one responsible, having staged the kidnapping in order to profit from the ransom. According to news reports, in March 2005, 27-year-old Jeremiah Overstreet was watching the film at home in Apopka, Florida, and decided to play Russian roulette. While nobody plays Russian roulette in Man on Fire, Washington's character does attempt to shoot himself, only for the gun to misfire. Overstreet was pronounced dead at the scene by authorities, and the shooting was ruled an accident. The 1993 college football film The Program follows the trial and tribulations of the fictional ESU Timberwolves as they deal with personal issues and setbacks on the way to victory. It sports an impressive cast, including Halle Berry, Omar Epps, and James Caan, but it's unfortunately most remembered for a scene that resulted in real-life tragedy. In the film, quarterback Joe Kane drunkenly declares that he's good under pressure as he lays in the middle of a road, casually reading a magazine while automobiles whiz by at dizzying speeds. His teammates reluctantly join him in a show of unity, bonding through their mix of courage, stupidity, and insanity. The scene ended up being heavily featured in trailers, which led film critic Jack Garner to note, "I dread the day I read about some real high school jocks who've been inspired to duplicate that irresponsible film sequence." Unfortunately, on October 16, 1994, two teenagers did attempt to bring that scene to life. They laid down on a 2-lane highway that ran through Polk, Pennsylvania. They were hit by a pickup truck and instantly killed. That same evening, a teenager in Long Island, New York, acting on a dare from friends, attempted the same stunt and met the same tragic results. With authorities and the media publicly noting the connection between the film and the deaths, Touchstone, a Disney subsidiary, issued a statement distancing themselves, stating, "The scene in the program clearly depicts this adolescent action as an irresponsible and dangerous stunt by a troubled and heavily intoxicated individual and in no way advocates or encourages this type of behavior. This is a tragedy and our sympathies go out to the families of those involved." Disney then quickly moved to have the scene removed from prints of the film. To date, the scene has never been restored, though it has been posted online. Most movies that withstand the test of time are known for their breakthrough performances, supreme direction, or just plain good storytelling. But for some films, their continued cinematic relevance has more to do with how controversial they were and how notoriously difficult it is for audiences to endure the movie even still. Here are a few films that will forever be associated with how much public pushback they received upon release. Last House on the Left. Nowadays, Wes Craven's name tends to conjure up images of Freddy Krueger or Ghostface from Scream. But years before Craven reshaped the horror genre, he started his directing career with a dark, dirty, uncomfortable movie called Last House on the Left. The 1972 movie follows a gang of psychos who brutally destroy 2 teenage girls, then seek refuge in a house that happens to belong to the parents of one of their victims. Last House's graphic assault sequences were controversial enough, but when combined with an uneven tone that includes a bizarre sheriff, the movie got some seriously negative press. The British Board of Film Classification rejected the film and labeled Last House on the Left a video nasty, meaning that all copies of any VHS tapes within England were to be seized by the police. The movie was only reclassified in 2008. Even one of the film's villains, actor Fred Lincoln, stated that he wished the film was banned internationally rather than just in the UK. This low-budget movie, produced for under $90,000, quickly gained such an unsavory reputation that some conspiracy theorists debated whether it had been funded by the mob or adult filmmakers. The Last Temptation of Christ. Biblical adaptations are never more than a few inches away from the cliffs of controversy, but this movie stirred up a reaction like no other. At first, 1988's The Last Temptation of Christ doesn't sound like a movie that would cause such a ruckus. It pulled in an Academy Award nomination for Catholic director Martin Scorsese, with a script by Calvinist Paul Schrader. However, the movie's depiction of Jesus Christ, as played by Willem Dafoe, is quite unconventional. Dafoe's Jesus is weary, run down, and tormented by self-doubt over his impending sacrifice. And on the cross, the movie's Jesus experiences a sort of dream sequence wherein he's tempted to climb down, get married to Mary Magdalene, have kids, and live an ordinary life. Jesus overcomes his last temptation by accepting his role as God's son. But the film was condemned before it was even finished, with its production igniting campaigns, protests, and petitions. Evangelist Bill Bright publicly offered to pay off the studio in exchange for handing over all prints of the film. The film was so loathed that a Paris theater showing The Last Temptation of Christ was even set on fire, landing 13 people in the hospital. Not as bad as what happened to the film's Jesus, but still, pretty bad. The Human Centipede 2, full sequence. We all remember back when the first Human Centipede came out, even if we wish we didn't. The story centered on a mad scientist's rather innovative idea of how to spread one supersized digestive system between 3 people. Understandably, the movie kicked up a flurry of controversy. However, upon its release, the actual Human Centipede movie turned out to be a surprisingly conventional B-horror movie, albeit one more gruesome than the norm. But that wasn't the case with the even more graphic sequel, The Human Centipede 2. This movie features a fanboy of the original film being so inspired that he creates a homemade copycat centipede of his own using staple guns, duct tape, and barbed wire. The BBFC argued that the grotesqueness of these sequences made it unfit for public consumption and effectively banned the movie in 2011. It met a similar fate with the censorship boards of Australia. Of course, the movie was followed with Human Centipede 3, a film that upped the violence even more, but also dropped off the radar much more quickly. Song of the South. Almost everyone has heard Disney's famous Zippity-Doo-Dah melody because it's practically a symbol of the House of Mouse. But even if you know the Academy Award-winning song, you've probably never seen the movie it originally came from. That's because the film in question, titled Song of the South, has been locked away in Disney's Forbidden Vault for almost 3 decades. It's widely regarded as a racially insensitive movie that perpetuates Southern slave stereotypes, with black characters like Uncle Remus being portrayed as jolly, happy-go-lucky folk who cheerfully serve their white oppressors. This romanticized, cozy BBC remaking of slavery's dark history has only become more shameful with time. Due to its infamy, Disney has tried to burrow the film out of the world's collective memory. The primary residual traces that remain are that famous tune, and the strange fact that many of the characters have survived as part of the Splash Mountain ride. The Devils. Though The Devils engendered a massive controversial backlash when it first came out in 1971, the studio-driven hacking and slashing that the film went through caused it to mostly disappear off the radar until a recent cult revival. The Devils is loosely based on the true story of Urban Grandier, an unconventional Catholic priest who was burned at the stake under accusations of witchcraft in the 1600s. Russell's fusion of religious iconography with graphic imagery set off a volcano of anger, with thundering protests greeting The Devil's release. Desperate to calm the reaction, the studio ordered countless cuts to the already expensive movie, slicing out so many key sequences that few people today have ever seen the original cut. However, various versions of the film have survived, going on to inspire contemporary filmmakers like Guillermo del Toro and Joe Dante. Life of Brian. Monty Python might have been heralded for the Holy Grail, but their 1979 comedy Life of Brian was a different story altogether. The film is a satirical take on the life of Christ, introducing the world to Brian of Nazareth, a regular guy who happens to be born on Christmas. Brian then ends up with the bad luck of being named as the Messiah and is eventually crucified by the Romans.
The little rascal has spirit? Has what, sir? Spirit? Yes, he did, sir.
Playing the Jesus story for laughs stirred up a tornado of controversy. Theaters showing Life of Brian were picketed, the film was banned in Norway, and the whole enterprise was condemned by religious groups. The BBC even aired a television debate pitting two Monty Python members, John Cleese and Michael Palin, against the Bishop of Southwark and religious spokesman Malcolm Muggeridge. Despite all the controversy, Life of Brian ended up being an enormous box office success.
Now, off!
Onset injuries are nothing new to dramatic actors who pursue challenging and physically demanding roles, and just about everyone's busted a toe at one point or another. But it's another thing entirely to torture your God-given temple before the movie even starts. Some actors are just insanely dedicated to their craft and have made some pretty intense sacrifices to sell movie tickets. Here are a few movies that caused serious damage to actors' bodies. Mila Kunis in Black Swan. The intense look that Black Swan took into the world of ballet was, unsurprisingly, pretty hard on the bodies of its stars. Mila Kunis had to lose 20 pounds to look like a ballerina, which might not sound too drastic, but it sent the 5'4" Kunis down to 95 pounds. Kunis lost the weight by sticking to a strict 1,200 calorie diet, which isn't necessarily damaging, but Kunis added smoking tons of cigarettes to the mix. Add to that 4 hours of ballet training every day for 7 weeks, and you have the perfect recipe for a messed up body. By the end of the film, Kunis had also torn a calf ligament and had scars on her back from being lifted. Natalie Portman, on the other hand, employed a stunt dancer. Kunis said she gained the weight back instantly after filming stopped, but the whole process was rough. So if you have any scripts about chilling in a tropical paradise, give Kunis a call. She deserves a break. Rooney Mara in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. It's easy to forget that Rooney Mara didn't always look like the rail-thin, raven-haired girl we know today. She was always very trim, but she used to look a little more girl next door than high-fashion model, or what it would look like if a Hot Topic and Lurch from the Addams Family had a baby. Needless to say, Mara had to undergo a big transformation to play Lisbeth Salander, which she achieved mostly by starving herself. Director David Fincher never asked her to slim down, but he didn't treat Mara like a delicate flower either. The director told her to get really drunk and come in the next day as hungover as possible to take pictures in order to convince Sony that Mara could look properly strung out. So, she got super drunk, threw up all night, and got the part. Side note, showing up drunk won't earn you bonus points at your normal job, so don't even try. Outside of mild liver damage, Mara was perpetually covered in bruises from the more violent scenes. Her injuries were so bad, the makeup artist thought that she'd already had makeup on when she showed up to the set and was horrified to discover it was all real. Hilary Swank in $1 Million Baby. When you sign up for boxing, even in a movie, you figure you'll end up with a lot of bruises. What you might not realize is that you'll have to drink raw eggs Rocky style every morning for weeks on end. Former Karate Kid, Hilary Swank, was always fit and athletic, but she said her training for $1 Million Baby was much harder than anything else she'd ever done. Swank needed to gain weight to play Maggie Fitzgerald and reach her goal by consuming 4,000 calories a day, and it didn't mean glorious, fat-filled trips to Five Guys. Instead, Swank had to eat 60 egg whites daily, which was pretty tough.
I had to eat 60 egg whites in a day, and I couldn't. I mean, I could barely eat 4. I drank them. I just would be like,
She also said that she needed to eat every 90 minutes, without exception. And even though getting up in the middle of the night to eat sounds like a pretty fun job, it's a lot less fun when you have to train 5 hours a day. She gained 23 pounds of muscle by the time filming started and suffered no serious side effects, but she probably has a hard time eating egg whites, which, to be fair, is just chicken birth goop anyhow. Ugh, gross. Adrien Brody in The Pianist. Another actor who got an Oscar for torturing himself, Adrien Brody fully devoted his life to The Pianist. Brody played a starving man who had lost his home and family during the Holocaust. So, to prepare for the part, he sold all his possessions, gave up his apartment, packed 2 bags and a keyboard, and moved to Europe. Brody ate as little as possible to achieve the skeletal figure of a starving man. In 6 weeks, he got down to 130 pounds, which is incredibly thin for a 6'5" man. The shoot was also full of physical and mental anguish. Brody missed his friends and family and had to spend each day in near isolation, pretending to live through the Holocaust, which he said threatened his sanity. But probably not as much as, real Holocaust survivors. He felt the suffering was worth it, telling the BBC, "I couldn't have acted loss without knowing it. I've experienced loss. I've experienced sadness in my life, but I didn't know the desperation that comes with hunger." Robert De Niro in Cape Fear. Veteran actor Robert De Niro is no stranger to putting his body through hell for a role. He famously gained 60 pounds to play Jack LaMotta in Raging Bull. And for Cape Fear, his transformation was even more extreme. To play a frightening criminal out for revenge, De Niro trained for 6 months to get his body fat down to a single digit. When he filmed the shirtless scenes, he cut weight like a fighter, refusing to drink any water during the shoot. And when he was dying for a drink, he'd pour some seltzer in his mouth and spit it out. Not content to settle for his bulked up physique, De Niro felt his teeth looked too pristine for the role, so he paid a dentist $5,000 to get them shaved down to look more grungy. Unfortunately, repairing teeth was a little harder. He had to shell out another $20,000 to get his movie star smile back. Shia LaBeouf in Fury. Most of Shia LaBeouf's notoriety comes from his off-the-set exploits, but it turns out he can be just as outrageous during filming. In the World War II drama Fury, LaBeouf plays a soldier trapped near enemy lines. So, completely unprompted by the director or producers, he maimed himself for the role when he decided his character needed to be missing a tooth. He found a shady dentist and showed up on set looking like a jack-o'-lantern. Co-star Logan Lerman reported an even stranger story, telling British GQ. LaBeouf walks out into the hallway and says, "Hey man, want to see something fun? Check this out." And he takes out a knife and cuts his face. The whole movie, he kept opening these cuts on his face. That's all real. Cutting your face to play a Bible-quoting soldier in the 40s seems a little nutty. But co-star Brad Pitt claims LaBeouf is one of the best actors he's ever worked with. You don't have to draw blood to really make it in this business, but it seems like it might help sometimes. And if Shia ever asks you if you want to see something cool, just say no.
Just do it!
Nope. Not even once.
Horror movies deal with all kinds of scary things, from vampires to werewolves to serial killers. But almost every horror movie has one thing in common: death. Lots and lots of death. Here are some of the most memorable horror movie deaths of all time. Directed by Ridley Scott, Alien hit theaters in 1979, and all these years later, people are still talking about the chest burster. The scene starts innocently enough. The crew of the Nostromo is sitting around a dinner table, enjoying a meal together. They're laughing and ribbing each other, and they're all glad their buddy Kane is doing okay. Just a few minutes earlier, Kane was unconscious with some sort of creature attached to his face, but now he seems all right until he starts convulsing.
I don't want to talk about what it's made of. I'm eating this.
Then, just a few seconds later, a parasite rips out of his chest, sending gallons of gore across the room. It's a little baby xenomorph, and it scampers away before anyone can kill it, leaving Kane's lifeless body behind. Even though it's been 4 decades since Alien hit theaters, this visceral scene still makes us nauseous to this day. Here's some good advice for horror movie characters. Stop visiting islands that are home to pagan cults. Those trips never end well. That's a lesson Thomas Richardson learns the hard way in Apostle. The film follows Thomas as he infiltrates the island of Ariston, hoping to rescue his sister from a bloodthirsty religious group. In the most gruesome scene in the film, Thomas is a bystander, helpless to intervene, as an innocent young man is killed in the most sadistic way possible. Jeremy is a lovable kid who's head over heels for a beautiful girl named Fionn. But when her psycho dad sticks a knife in her gut, Jeremy is framed for the crime. He's then tossed onto a nasty torture device called the Heathen's Stand. His head and limbs are held in place with bone-crushing vices, and as the poor guy screams in fear and pain, a rusty drill slowly but surely bores into his skull. It's a shockingly violent scene, made even worse because Jeremy is so kind-hearted. As that drill leaves a gaping hole where his brain used to be, we're turning our heads away from the screen as fast as possible. Hereditary is a film filled with shocking scenes, but arguably none more horrifying than the death of Charlie. She's got a major peanut allergy, and when she takes a bite of a nut-filled cake, she goes into shock. Her older brother Peter grabs her and starts tearing down the road, rushing to the hospital as fast as he can, while Charlie gasps for breath in the back seat. That's when Charlie decides to stick her head out the window, hoping it will help her catch her breath. Peter frantically swerves out of the way of a dead deer in the road, and the unthinkable happens. There's a sickening thud, and Charlie's head goes flying off her shoulders. It's a moment that comes out of absolutely nowhere. Audiences were expecting Charlie would be a major character throughout the film, but not even halfway into the story, this 13-year-old girl has been decapitated, and that look on Peter's face is the same look we all had when Charlie's head went tumbling down the road. After escaping a store filled with psychos and a parking lot crawling with killer bugs, the 5 survivors dive off into the mist, hoping to find help. They drive for hours, and eventually their car runs out of gas. As they sit on the side of the road, they think about what might happen if they get attacked by that thing with the spiky tentacles, or if they're webbed up by those giant spiders. Getting ripped apart by otherworldly monsters is nobody's idea of a peaceful death, so they choose to take their own lives. Unfortunately, they only have 4 bullets, so the leader of the bunch does the deed, offing everybody, including his 8-year-old son. It's an absolutely devastating scene. The car is filled with corpses, and our hero is screaming at the top of his lungs. But then, adding insult to injury, the military comes rolling on by. If only the survivors had waited a minute or two, they would have found salvation. Instead, The Mist has one of the most hopeless endings in cinematic history, one that still wrecks horror fans to this day. Freddy Krueger is one of cinema's most ingenious serial killers. He's turned victims into puppets, smashed them into TVs, and morphed them into motorcycles. But Krueger's most iconic kill is still one of his very first, when he turns Johnny Depp into Old Faithful. The premise of A Nightmare on Elm Street is simple. Don't fall asleep, or else Freddy Krueger will kill you in your dreams. But poor old Glenn just can't stay awake. So when he drifts away in his bed, that's when Freddy shows up ready for fun. His gloved hand comes out of Glenn's mattress and drags the screaming teen down into the abyss. There's a pause just for a second, and then gallons and gallons of blood shoot out of the bed. It's dark, red, and disgusting, and the geyser seems to last forever. The Omen follows U.S. Ambassador Robert Thorne, a man who suspects his adopted son Damien might be the spawn of Satan. And Thorne isn't the only one who thinks Damien might have a really bad dad. Photographer Keith Jennings also wonders if Damien has demonic DNA, so he teams up with Thorne to uncover the truth about this creepy little kid. Eventually, their quest takes them to Israel, where they learn there's only one way to defeat the Antichrist: stab him with 7 sacred daggers. Naturally, Thorne is reluctant to murder his adopted son, but Jennings is totally gung-ho about preventing Armageddon. But as he goes to collect the knives, the forces of evil decide that Jennings has got to go. When a work truck accidentally rolls downhill, a giant pane of glass goes flying out of the bed. Jennings looks up at the exact wrong moment, and the glass sheet sends his head spinning through the air in slow motion. It's an incredible special effect, one that shocks us no matter how many times we've seen it. David Cronenberg is the king of body horror, and his disturbing powers are on full display in Scanners. Released in 1981, Scanners takes place in a world where psychics exist, and naturally, people who can read minds are the next big step in private security. In the film's most explosive scene, a security company called Consec plans on showing off their scanner service by having a mild-mannered mind reader demonstrate his abilities. Unfortunately, when he calls for volunteers, he picks a guy named Daryl, who happens to be a super powerful telepath. Even worse, Daryl is kind of an evil jerk. When the unassuming scanner tries to get into his brain, Daryl turns the tables. The poor guy begins to shake and twitch as Daryl attacks his mind, smiling and sneering the entire time. The unassuming scanner is clearly in pain, suffering the world's worst headache, and when the psychic pressure becomes too much, his head explodes all over the place. Blood and brains go flying everywhere, and the scene is still absolutely mind-blowing today. A common trope of the horror genre is that hillbillies are all psychopaths just waiting to chop you up with a chainsaw. But Tucker and Dale vs. Evil subverts that cliche by showcasing two lovable good old boys whose vacation is interrupted by a group of college kids that mistake them for Deliverance-style rednecks. And since these kids have seen one too many horror movies, they declare war on the backwoods bumpkins. Of course, these kids aren't exactly skilled when it comes to murder, and every time they try to murder Tucker and Dale, they just end up killing themselves in progressively more gruesome ways. Perhaps the most jaw-dropping moment comes as Tucker is tossing logs into a wood chipper. That's when one of the college kids, armed with a screwdriver, sneaks up on Tucker and tries to jump on his back. Unfortunately, Tucker bends over at the exact moment, and the kid goes sailing right into the machine. A horrified Tucker does his best to pull the guy out, but he gets covered in gooey red bits of college student. The scene is equal parts horrendous and hilarious, and Tucker makes it even funnier when he asks the mangled-up kid one very dumb question.
You okay?
Near the end of this home invasion thriller, our hero Erin has dispatched the masked killers who butchered her boyfriend's family. But there are still more foes to face. As it turns out, the assassins were hired by her boyfriend's brother, Felix, who was hoping to kill his family so he could inherit his parents' fortune. Unfortunately, Felix didn't know that Erin was basically an Australian Jason Bourne. So when the two finally throw down, Erin gets clever with some kitchen utensils. But while pots and knives come in handy, Erin lands the final blow by shoving the blades of a blender into the top of Felix's head. And then, to make sure that he won't get away, she plugs the blender into the wall and makes herself a brain shake. The scene takes all the elements you need for a fantastic horror movie death, creativity, comedy, and a whole lot of gore, and blends them together perfectly, so to speak. Bill Murray's appearance in Zombieland is the greatest cameo of all time. There's no debating this. It's a scientific fact. But what makes it so great? Well, first of all, Murray is playing himself trying to survive the zombie apocalypse. Second, Murray is blasted to Kingdom Come in one of the most hysterical deaths ever put to film. It all starts innocently enough. A group of survivors hanging out in Hollywood decide to spend the night in Murray's mansion. At first, the house seems abandoned. But then, the comedian comes stumbling out of the shadows. His skin is pale, his arms are outstretched, and he's moaning like he's one of the living dead. As it turns out, he's just pulling a prank, but Columbus isn't in on the joke. When Murray staggers into the room, Columbus whips out a shotgun and shoots the actor at point-blank range. The joke is perfectly timed and incredibly shocking, especially when Murray reacts with his trademark deadpan wit.
Is that how you say hello? Where you come from?
Oh my god, I can't believe I shot Bill Murray.
The real kicker comes when Murray's accepted that he's a goner.
Do you have any regrets?
Garfield, maybe?
Ever since it was introduced in 1968, the MPAA's G rating has been assigned to assure audiences that the movie they're about to watch is good, wholesome entertainment that the whole family can enjoy. Or at least that's what it's supposed to mean. But every now and then, something truly disturbing slips through the cracks and makes you wonder just how many of the ratings board members were actually paying attention during their screenings. Get ready to revisit your most memorable childhood traumas as we dive into the most disturbing moments in G-rated movie history. All Dogs Go to Heaven, except this one time. Despite the cute, reassuring title of All Dogs Go to Heaven, the film presented an afterlife that's actually pretty messed up. In the beginning of the movie, our four-legged hero Charlie is shown getting drugged and literally murdered by his business partner. To repeat, the dog is betrayed, intoxicated, and then killed in the opening act. And that's not even the worst of it. Since all dogs supposedly go to heaven, Charlie finds himself at the pearly gates and decides he isn't ready to chill with God Dog just yet.
I don't want to die. You got the wrong guy.
Why? Because he's got to get revenge first. But once he sets out on his return-to-Earth plan, it eventually dawns on him that he might have just blown his shot at spending eternity in the good place. So there's an extended nightmare sequence in which Charlie is told he can't return to heaven and has to go to doggy hell instead. And the filmmakers did not hold back on how terrible that eventuality would be. His vision is a straight-up lake of fire hell where Satan rises from the flames as a dragon and tortures him with demons. It's as if Dante Alighieri scripted this thing himself, or maybe just Ronnie James Dio. All those little tykes watching that scene were probably scarred for life and terrified about what might come after. The deadly burden of intelligence. Picking out a single disturbing moment from The Secret of NIMH is pretty difficult.
But my son's life is in great danger.
Remember the climactic fight scene when the mean rat slices another across the chest before getting stabbed in the gut and then daggered in the back? That's pretty brutal stuff for a grade schooler to witness. But perhaps the most horrifying moment comes in when we find out the reason all our rodent pals are suddenly so smart and self-aware. As it turns out, they were captured from the streets and given intelligence enhancement treatments at a human medical lab. The medicine worked, so when the rats try to escape the facility and most of them die in the process, they can actually fully comprehend the value of their lives before losing them. Sid's Toys. There's a good chance that Sid Phillips is the single most terrifying villain in Disney's entire filmography. It's not just that he attempts to shoot Buzz Lightyear into space with fireworks. That's actually one of the more normal things he does. He also has a little toy lab at home where he rips all kinds of playthings apart just so he can Frankenstein stitch them back together in supremely freakish ways. Some of his creepiest creations include a severed doll head with a gouged eye that's been grafted onto a spider-like metal body and a pair of Barbie legs attached to a fishing reel. They look menacing enough, but what's truly disturbing is the fact that we know all these toys are secretly alive, and that they're probably actually suffering during all of Sid's experiments. Sex Tree. The same company that brought us those classic feel-good holiday films like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Santa Claus is Coming to Town also tried to get theatrical with 1982's The Last Unicorn, and the results were pretty surreal. The film follows a unicorn who's trying to find others of her kind but becomes trapped in a carnival filled with all kinds of tortured animal souls, including a bird lady with 3 giant breasts. She eventually makes pals with a half-wit wizard named Schmindrick who helps her escape.
My dear, you deserve the services of a great wizard, but I'm afraid you'll have to be glad of the aid of a second-rate pickpocket.
Along their journey, he accidentally uses his transformative magic on a tree, which wants nothing more than to make little saplings with him.
Oh, I love you.
So if you know any 80s kids with a strange fetish for giant wooden boobs, well, this is probably why.
I love you. Love, 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 love.
Oh, what have I done?
The Psychedelic Terror Tunnel. 1971's Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory has been an almost universally beloved children's movie for nearly 50 years. But the whole thing is pretty cruel and wicked if you think about it. Consider when young Augustus Gloop is nearly drowned in a chocolate river because he goes for the chocolate water in a room that Wonka tells him is entirely edible. Or when Violet Beauregard is basically blown up for taking an unapproved bite of candy and has to be juiced by the Oompa Loompas, whatever that entails. And Wonka himself is far creepier than any ironic punishment his factory could contain. The climax of the film hinges on him manipulating and lying to everyone around him as a test to find a worthy replacement. In other words, he spends the entire movie messing with kids' minds just for the hell of it. In one especially terrifying scene, he takes everyone through his strobe-lit psychedelic tunnel just to shock them with imagery of a worm crawling over a dead man's face and a live chicken having its head cut off with a meat cleaver. Throw in Willie's sinister slam poetry.
Is the Grizzly Reaper mowing? Yes! The danger must be growing, for the rowers keep on rowing!
And you've got yourself one of the greatest nightmares ever committed to film. But hey, how about all that tasty candy, kids?
Hollywood has definitely ramped up the amount of on-screen gore and violence over the years, but there have been a few movies that managed to exceed anyone's expectations. Some movies live on in infamy for taking things just a bit too far. Thanks to some supremely excessive brutality, here are some films that have become unforgettable for all the wrong reasons.
Hold on to your butts.
Oldboy. When we're talking about Oldboy, we're of course referring to Park Chan-wook's timeless, jaw-dropping film, and not the unfortunate Spike Lee remake. For those unfamiliar with the Korean revenge flick, a deadbeat alcoholic dad gets abducted and locked in a tiny hotel room for 15 years straight, with no rhyme or reason as to why he's been imprisoned there. Understandably, as soon as he's released, he immediately sets out on a revenge mission and finds one of the people hired to keep him in confinement. To get back at him, he whips out a claw and hammer and goes to town on the man's mouth. And let's just say the resulting scene makes your worst trip to the dentist look like a vacation to Disney World. Fight Club. David Fincher's Fight Club had its fair share of scenes that went too far. It spliced single frames of full frontal nudity into various parts of the movie, and its underground fights had just enough meat-smacking oomph to them that viewers felt every blow. Edward Norton's unnamed everyman protagonist had a lot of pent-up rage against the world, and he was finally starting to let it trickle out after learning the ways of the traveling soap salesman Tyler Durden. Perhaps the most grueling moment of the movie, though, happens when Norton's character faces down Jared Leto's angel face and pounds him into absolute oblivion, going well beyond the established rules of Fight Club. Norton's fists bashing into the man's once pristine visage until it's a bloody pulp of bruises and broken teeth easily leaves viewers stupefied by the narrator's sadistic, relentless assault. Human Centipede. If you're unfamiliar with the premise of the human centipede, a quick Google image search should be able to convey the sick experiments done by the film's maniacal villain. 3 tourists get drugged and imprisoned by a mad German surgeon who hopes to create a new life form by sewing people together. So the devilish dude stitches the poor trio into succession from mouth to butt with the hopes that they form one single digestive tract. And as you might imagine, things don't go exactly to plan.
Guys, I'm really sick.
It's just as abhorrent and barf-worthy as you would expect, and the sequels only get worse from there. Dead Alive. Before Peter Jackson became a household name with Lord of the Rings, he directed a series of low-budget B-movies and horror flicks. The most noteworthy of his earlier films would have to be Dead Alive. This splatter flick focused on a man whose mother gets bitten by a Sumatran rat monkey and spreads an undead plague throughout town. The central character then goes to absurd lengths to save himself and his girlfriend from the decaying cannibal horde. And as gross, macabre, and fun as Dead Alive is, its most messed up part would have to be when a zombie baby rips its way out of the face of a poor victim at our hero's house. Just use your imagination to figure out how the creature got in there and kiss your appetite goodbye forever. The Exorcist. William Friedkin's groundbreaking horror film broke barriers and introduced a new kind of terror that moviegoers were simply not ready for. Linda Blair's portrayal of 12-year-old Regan McNeil's demonic possession was unlike anything fans had ever seen. Little Regan's various stages of transformation and torture were both vivid and terrifying, and the movie-loving world would be hard-pressed to forget her gravity-defying levitation, that 360-degree head rotation, and all the projectile vomit. And yet, all of it paled in comparison to the most shocking and controversial part of The Exorcist, that crucifix scene. When it comes to possession-centric violence, it just doesn't get any worse than that. A Serbian film. Now, here's a movie that might just be better left unseen altogether, if not for its technical brilliance. A Serbian film tells the story of a semi-retired porn star who is at the end of his rope financially and decides to film some kind of artsy film that he isn't used to making. For some reason, the art film's creators need a man of his talents, and it isn't until he reaches the set when he finds out why. The art project is actually a snuff film, filmed with horrific things no one should ever get any kind of enjoyment out of watching or filming. Writer-director Srđan Spasojević has said that the film's controversial violence is symbolic of the Serbian people's horrific mistreatment by their government. He wanted to create the opposite of the dull, predictable, and uninspired flicks made by his countrymen, but unfortunately the rest of the world didn't care for his graphic metaphor. A Serbian film has since been banned in multiple countries and pulled from the shelves of most major movie retailers. Antichrist. Director Lars von Trier is accustomed to controversy, with a filmography that includes projects like Dogville, Melancholia, and Nymphomaniac. But his 2009 film Antichrist is the project that pushed viewers to the very brink of their sanity. Willem Dafoe and Charlotte Gainsbourg portray a couple who mourn the loss of their toddler, who fell to his death while they were getting hot and heavy. The father is a therapist who decides to help his traumatized lover by taking her to a cabin in the woods. What happens there forces the mourning mother off the deep end. Gainsbourg's character eventually tortures herself and her lover in all kinds of appalling ways, and the part that'll really make you cry occurs when Dafoe's crown jewels get smashed to bits by a giant block of wood.
I think I'm gonna be sick.
Surprisingly enough, things actually do get worse from that point forward, because this movie just couldn't stop at tortured nether regions alone. Of course not.
We all love these 80s classics, but there's something pretty messed up in every single one of them. And the weird part, you might not have even noticed them until now. 1984's Ghostbusters is one of the most beloved comedy classics of all time, spawning a franchise that encompasses everything, including 2 different Saturday morning cartoons. It's also full of weirdness that goes well beyond the supernatural forces gathering at the top of Dana's apartment building. The most bizarre element might just be how the movie's characters ignore one of its first hints of supernatural powers. When we're introduced to fan favorite Dr. Peter Venkman, played by Bill Murray, he's running a psychological experiment with a couple of grad students. The whole thing is rigged, a detail that's meant to underline Venkman's snarky, somewhat slimy personality. His tactics are less about research and more about flirting with a pretty blonde, which is probably why the university was inclined to fire the whole department. But there's one thing that's easy to miss. The experiment actually works.
There's a couple of wavy lines. Sorry, this isn't your lucky day.
The whole thing is ostensibly designed to show whether stress in the form of electric shocks can enhance psychic abilities. It turns out that it does, but Venkman decides to ignore that result. It's pretty surprising, since scientifically proving the existence of psychic powers probably would have been the biggest story of his career if he hadn't also fought a giant marshmallow with nuclear laser beams later that year. Set 5 years after the events of the original, Ghostbusters 2 starts off with so many leaps in logic that it sometimes feels less like a sequel and more like a reboot. In the space between the 2 movies, Dana Barrett has ended her relationship with Peter Venkman, gotten married to someone else, had a son, and gotten divorced, and also managed to completely change careers. She goes from being a professional cellist at the New York Philharmonic to working in restoration at the Museum of Modern Art, 2 highly specialized jobs that require vastly different training and education. It's even worse for the Ghostbusters themselves, with the team falling on some pretty hard times. Peter has a cheesy TV show about psychic phenomena, and Winston and Ray are even reduced to appearing in their uniforms at children's parties. The reason? They were sued for all the property damage at the end of the first movie and forbidden from busting any ghosts. That gives audiences the same kind of scrappy team of lovable losers that they loved in the first movie, but since the New York City that we see in Ghostbusters is pretty much under constant attack from the supernatural, it's tough to believe they'd turn on our heroes. Even the most jaded New Yorkers probably aren't going to forget that time a giant sugary kaiju stomped through the Upper West Side and flattened a church. Having citizens denying that happened is a pretty big stretch, even for a movie that asks us to believe in mood slime. While it wasn't a huge success when it hit theaters in 1987, The Princess Bride became a cult classic on home video, and it's easy to see why. Framed as a story being read to a sick child, the swashbuckling tale of fencing, fighting, giants, monsters, chases, escapes, true love, and miracles feels like the best fairy tale ever told, and gave people seeking revenge for the deaths of their fathers the perfect speech to quote as many times as they needed to. What many moviegoers might not realize, however, is that The Princess Bride isn't just a book in the movie. It's one in real life, too. Written by William Goldman, who also wrote the screenplay for the film, it even has a similar framing sequence. The premise is that it's Goldman doing an abridged version of a story his grandfather used to read him on sick days, full of commentary and asides. It's got plenty of scenes that didn't make the film too, including detailed origin stories for Inigo and Fezzik, and a terrifying trip through Prince Humperdinck's Zoo of Death. There's also a different ending in there, one that's much darker and more ambiguous than the happily ever after of the movie, in which Wesley continues to suffer from having his life drained, Inigo's wounds reopen, and Humperdinck's men close in as the group tries to escape. You might think that's not a big deal, and that movies based on books change things all the time. And you'd be right, except for one thing. In the novel, Goldman claims to be surprised at the ending himself because his grandfather always skipped over that part. Given that Peter Falk's character in the film often skips over things that he doesn't think young Fred Savage would like, it stands to reason that he might have bailed on the downer ending too, keeping it from both his grandson and the movie-going audience. Who could have guessed that movie was lying to you for the past 30 years? One of the more interesting things about Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure is how it treats time travel. Rufus, for instance, is only able to come back in time to help the Wild Stallions with their history report because he lives in a future where they already succeeded. The movie also plays with the idea of Bill and Ted being helped out by their own future selves, as long as they remember to actually go back and do it.
Dear Bill and Ted, Good luck on the report. Sincerely, Bill S. Preston, Esquire, and Ted Theodore Logan.
That's what time travel experts call a closed loop, and you see a similar, much less comedic approach in Terminator. But if you actually start to think about the inescapable pull of destiny that we see from our slacker heroes, though, things start to get pretty grim. Throughout the movie, Bill and Ted collect important historical figures to come address the students of San Dimas High. And given that we're working within a closed loop, they logically have to return to their own native times afterward so they can fulfill their own histories. The thing is, most of those histories involve horrifically violent deaths. Abraham Lincoln is, of course, shot in the back of the head by John Wilkes Booth. Billy the Kid is famously gunned down by Pat Garrett. Socrates was sentenced to die by poison. Joan of Arc is burned alive at the stake for heresy and then had her body burned again to prevent the faithful from collecting her ashes. Genghis Khan's cause of death was unknown, but come on, it probably wasn't pleasant. Only Beethoven, Napoleon, and Freud died of natural causes, but even then, the latter two suffered from particularly painful varieties of cancer. Bill and Ted never actually learn anything about history, and in a closed loop, they couldn't have changed their fates even if they wanted to, but still. It's a pretty rough image to keep in mind when you're watching our history pals goof around at San Dimas Mall. Unlike Bill and Ted or Terminator, 1985's classic Back to the Future presents a view of time travel where you actually can change the past. That's why Marty McFly is in danger of being wiped out if he doesn't fix the timeline in 1955, as evidenced by the scenes where he almost fades out of existence before he manages to get his parents back together. We also know that the 1985 he returns to isn't the one he left. Among other things, the Twin Pines Mall has become the Lone Pine Mall after Marty knocks down one of the trees with the DeLorean in the past. What really complicates things, though, is that Marty sees that timeline's version of himself heading back to the past in Doc Brown's time machine after he arrives back in the future. You might think that's just closing the loop, but watch the end of the movie. The Marty that leaves isn't the one who grew up in a crappy subdivision with an underachieving father. It's a Marty who grew up in a world where George McFly was a successful go-getter novelist. So where did that world's Marty go when he traveled back in time? We know from Back to the Future 2 that time can be split into alternate realities. So presumably the good timeline Marty comes back to another different future, and then watches a third Marty vanish in the DeLorean, and so on. There's an infinite number of Martys who can never truly go home again, and who live out their days in a universe that simply is not theirs. No wonder he's depressed in the future. Even looking back 3 decades later, 1988's Who Framed Roger Rabbit still stands as a masterpiece. In a timeline when we've seen plenty of movies where people are acting alongside computer-generated characters who aren't actually there, Bob Hoskins sells the idea of interacting with a cartoon better than anyone else. Plus, the reveal of Judge Doom as a maniacal, daggered-eyed toon is one of the most enjoyably terrifying moments to ever make it into a movie that was supposed to be for kids. But while Judge Doom being dissolved in boiling acid at the end of the movie is a pretty well-known piece of nightmare fuel, the thing we never seem to talk about is that he actually wins in the end. His entire evil plot revolves around destroying Toontown and paving it over so he can build a new kind of road called a freeway. Even if Eddie Valiant stopped him in the 40s, that's exactly what eventually happened. Just ask anyone who's ever been to Los Angeles. There's a whole lot of freeway and no sign of any tunes. In addition to giving an entire generation of kids some pretty unrealistic expectations about what they could find by poking into holes in their backyards, 1985's The Goonies stands as one of the best adventure movies of all time. It has action, danger, and death traps, and rewards the brave and clever kids with an unimaginable pirate treasure at the end. But even if you're completely on board with the premise and the adventure, it's hard to believe that the treasure would still be there when Mikey and his pals got to One-Eyed Willie's ship. While it's pretty easy to imagine that people might be scared off by a pipe organ made of bones, it's a little tougher to believe that Chester Copperpot was the only person in 350 years to try following the caves all the way to the Inferno. If nothing else, somebody had to go down there to dig the wishing well, or to put in the water pipes for Astoria's country club, and would have stumbled on the path by accident. Even if they were killed off by one of Willie's many death traps, someone would have eventually gone looking for them and found the Inferno waiting at the end.
But what if
You guys, just what if this map could lead to One-Eyed Willie's rich stuff?
What really makes it hard to swallow, though, is that the treasure map is only in Mikey's attic because it was donated to the local museum. Any curator worth their salt should have at least verified the authenticity of a document like that, and if they had, they would have spotted the clues that led the Goonies to the treasure right away. Apparently, Mikey's dad didn't even bother to take it out of its frame, so it stands to reason that he's actually pretty terrible at the basic function of his job, which is probably why they're in such bad financial shape to begin with. Remember how Raiders of the Lost Ark is about world-renowned adventurer and actually pretty terrible archaeologist Indiana Jones trying to recover the Ark of the Covenant from the Nazis? And remember how in the end, when Belloc and his Third Reich associates open up the Ark, the vengeful spirits within come out and kill all the Nazis by literally melting the flesh off their bones? You should, because it's pretty awesome. But here's the thing.
What about your boss, Der Fuhrer? I thought he was waiting to take possession.
The only reason Belloc and the Nazis do that ceremony out in the desert instead of in the heart of Nazi Germany is because Indy himself destroys the airplane that was going to transport the Ark back to the Fuhrer. If he hadn't, Belloc would have opened the Ark back in Berlin, where Hitler himself, and possibly the rest of Nazi high command, would have been present to be melted along with everyone else. Considering Raiders takes place in 1936, Indy's involvement kept World War II from ending a full 9 years earlier than it actually did. Thanks a lot, Indy.
For most of us, the best thing about horror movies is the part where they aren't real. But for a handful of disturbed fans, these stories about slashers, stalkers, and bloodthirsty vampires have inspired dangerous and deadly copycat killings. Here's the terrifying truth of 7 horror movies that became true-life crime scenes. Nightmare on Elm Street. It was September 2004 in London when 26-year-old Daniel Gonzalez stabbed 4 people to death. A gruesome series of murders, just like something out of a nightmare on Elm Street. Gonzalez reportedly fantasized about becoming a serial killer, with horror film villain Freddy Krueger serving as his inspiration. A diary entry written after his first murder read, "I will be a serial killer. I mean it. I promise." Gonzalez was sentenced to 6 life sentences at a maximum security sanatorium in Berkshire, England. But in the end, he only spent a year behind bars before taking another life, his own. Gonzalez was found dead in his room at Broadmoor Hospital in August of 2007. The Purge. In this dystopian thriller, America has come up with a chilling annual tradition to ensure a peaceful, thriving society.
Commencing at the siren, any and all crime, including murder, will be legal for 12 continuous hours.
Not only did the film spawn a franchise, it also inspired a copycat, Jonathan Cruz, who murdered 3 people during a violent 4-day spree in 2016. Police couldn't explain Cruz's motives for the seemingly indiscriminate murders until they interviewed his acquaintances, who revealed that before committing his crimes, the killer had often talked about his desire to do a so-called purge. A jury of Cruz's peers responded by purging him from society. He's serving 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Saw. With its graphic gore and gross-out torture killings, Saw is a franchise that's hard to stomach, but one man found it horribly inspiring. In a clear copycat reenactment of a scene from the film, 25-year-old Matthew Tinling murdered his neighbor, 45-year-old Richard Hamilton, stabbing the older man repeatedly and then slicing through his spinal cord. Unlike the sadistic Jigsaw, Tinling was motivated by ordinary greed. He wanted Hamilton to hand over the pen for his bank account. And unlike Jigsaw, Tinling won't be headlining a franchise. He's spending the next 30 years in prison for his crime. Halloween. After watching Rob Zombie's 2007 remake of the classic 1978 slasher flick Halloween, 17-year-old Jake Evans wanted to be like Michael Myers, the masked lunatic who kills his family on the spookiest night of the year. Evans shot and killed his 15-year-old sister Mallory and his 48-year-old mother Jamie on October 3, 2012. Then penned a confession explaining that he was inspired by Myers' remorselessness, writing, "I was thinking to myself it would be the same for me when I kill someone." Unlike Michael Myers, Evans won't be back for a sequel. In January 2013, he was sentenced to 45 years in prison. Scream. Wes Craven's horror classic Scream inspired a slew of sequels and at least one real-life crime.
In 2001, Thierry Girardin lured 15-year-old schoolgirl Alison Cambier into his home in Belgium under the pretense of giving her some VHS tapes.
But when Girardin made romantic advances toward Cambier, she rejected him, at which point he put on a ghost face mask and stabbed the girl more than 30 times. Girardin allegedly placed her body on his bed, put a rose in her mouth, and called his father to confess the killing, which he claimed was both premeditated and motivated by the events seen in Scream, which just goes to show that he totally missed the point of the movie.
I said, don't you blame the movies! Movies don't create psychos!
Interview with the Vampire. In 1994, 25-year-old Daniel Sterling and 23-year-old Lisa Stellwagen headed to the theater to see this buzzed-about vampire film, which starred Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise as its main bloodsuckers. Later, Stellwagen woke up to find Sterling staring at her. When she asked what was wrong, he said he was going to kill her and drink her blood. Sterling must not have sounded too convincing, because his girlfriend fell back asleep instead of running screaming from the room. But she should have. Later that day, Sterling stabbed Stellwagen 7 times, and did indeed drink her blood, though luckily the woman survived.
I've trained you for the point of death.
Sterling's attorney tried to argue that the film was to blame for Sterling's crime, but the jury didn't buy the "vampires made me do it" defense. They convicted him of attempted first-degree murder. Child's Play. A film that awakened an entire generation's fear of dolls, this 1988 supernatural slasher centers on Chucky, a demonic plaything possessed by the soul of a deceased serial killer. But it also played a role in one of Britain's most sadistic murders. In December 1992, Bernadette McNeely kidnapped a 16-year-old girl named Suzanne Capper, who was stripped naked, forced into a bathtub filled with disinfecting liquid, and made to listen to recordings of McNeely imitating Chucky. Those tapes kept playing while McNeely and her accomplices beat their victim and ripped out her front teeth. Suzanne Capper died after being dumped into a wooded area and set on fire. McNeely and 3 of her 5 associates were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. But the story didn't end there.
In 2014, McNeely was paroled.
She's currently living under a new name in an undisclosed location in northwest England, and hopefully not plotting a sequel.